Hello, everybody! I'm doing a live reading of Mort. It is the 5th part of a series. I have it on a playlist. Watch that if you want to watch a guy read I don't even know how old, science fantasy comedy book. Let's go. Mort thought that history was thrashing around like a steel Mort thought that history was thrashing around like a steel hawser with the tension up, twanging backwards and forwards across reality in great destructive sweeps. History isn't like that. History unravels gently, like an old sweater. It has been patched and darned many times, re-knitted to suit different people, shoved in a box under the sink of censorship to be cut up for the dusters of propaganda. Yet it always, eventually, manages to spring back into its old familiar shape. History has a habit of changing the people who think they are changing it. History always has a few tricks up its frayed sleeve. It's been around a long time. This is what was happening. The misplaced stroke of Mort's sight had cut history into two separate realities. In the city of Stolat Princess... there should be a comma there. In the city of Stolat, Princess Kelly still ruled, with a certain amount of difficulty and with the full-time aid of the royal recognizer, who was put on the court payroll and charged with the duty of remembering that she existed. In the lands outside, though, beyond the plain, in the ramtops around the Circle Sea, and all the way to the Rim, the traditional reality still held sway, and she was quite definitely dead. The Duke was king, and the world was proceeding sedately according to plan, whatever that was. The point is that both realities were true. The sort of historical event horizon was currently about 20 miles away from the city, and wasn't yet very noticeable. That's because call it the difference in historical pressures, wasn't yet very great. But it was growing. Out in the damp cabbage fields there was a shimmer in the air, and a faint sizzle like flying grasshoppers. People don't alter history any more than birds alter the sky. They just make brief patterns in it, inch by inch, implacable as a glacier and far colder. The real reality was grinding back towards Stolat. Mort was the first person to notice. It had been a long afternoon. The mountaineer had held on to his icy handhold until the last moment, and the executee had called Mort a lackey of the monarch's state. Only the old lady of 103, who had gone to her rewards surrounded by her sorrowing relatives, had smiled at him and said he was looking a little pale. The disk sun was close to the horizon by the time Binky cantered warily through the skies over Stolat, and Mort looked down and saw the borderland of reality. It curved away below him, a crescent of faint silver mist. He didn't know what it was, but he had a nasty foreboding that it had something to do with him. He reined in the horse and allowed him to trot gently towards the ground, touching down a few yards behind the wall of iridescent air. It was moving at something less than walking pace, hissing gently as it drifted ghost-like across the stark, damp cabbage fields and frozen drainage ditches. It was a cold night, the type of night when frost and fog fight for domination, and every sound is muffled. Binky's breath made fountains of cloud in the still air. He whinnied gently, almost apologetically, and pawed at the ground. Mort slid out of the saddle and crept up into the interface. It crackled softly. Weird shapes coruscated across it, flowing and shifting and disappearing. After some searching, he found a stick and poked it cautiously into the wall. It made strange ripples that wobbled slowly out of sight. Mort looked up as a shape drifted overhead. It was a black owl patrolling the ditches for anything small and squeaky. It hit the wall with a splash of sparkling mist, leaving an owl-shaped ripple that grew and spread until it joined the boiling kaleidoscope. Then it vanished. Mort could see through the transparent interface, and certainly no owl reappeared on the other side. Just as he was puzzling over this, there was another soundless splash a few feet away, and the bird burst into view again, totally unconcerned, and skimmed away across the fields. Mort pulled himself together and stepped toward the barrier, which was no barrier at all. Let me read that again. Mort pulled himself together and stepped through the barrier, which was no barrier at all. It tingled. A moment later, Binky burst through after him, eyes rolling in desperation and tendrils of interface catching on his hooves. He reared up, shaking his mane like a dog to remove clinging fibers of mist, and looked at Mort beseechingly. Mort caught his bridle, patted him on the nose, and fumbled in his pocket for a rather grubby sugar lump. He was aware that he was in the presence of something important, but he wasn't yet quite sure what it was. There was a road running between an avenue of damp and gloomy willow trees. Mort remounted and steered Binky across the field into the dripping darkness under the branches. In the distance, he could see the lights of Stow Hallet, which really wasn't much more than a small town, and a faint glow on the edge of sight must be Stow Lat. He looked at it longingly. The barrier worried him. He could see it creeping across the field behind the trees. Mort was on the point of urging Binky back into the air when he saw the light immediately ahead of him, warm and beckoning. It was spilling from the windows of a large building set back from the road. It was probably a cheerful sort of light in any case, but in these surroundings and compared with Mort's mood, it was positively ecstatic. As he rode nearer, he saw shadows moving against it, and made out a few snatches of song. It was an inn, and inside there were people having a good time. Or what passed for a good time if you were a peasant who spent most of your time closely concerned with cabbages. Compared to brassicas, practically anything is fun. There were human beings in there, doing uncomplicated human things like getting drunk and forgetting the worlds of song. Mort had never really felt homesick, possibly because his mind had been too occupied with other things. But he felt it now for the first time, a sort of longing, not for a place, but for a state of mind, for being just an ordinary human being with straightforward things to worry about, like money and sickness and other people. I shall have a drink, he thought, and perhaps I shall feel better. There was an open-fronted stable at one side of the main building, and he led Binky into the warm, horse-smelling darkness that already accommodated 3 other horses. As Mort unfastened the nose-bag, he wondered if Death's horse felt the same way about other horses, which had rather less supernatural lifestyles. He certainly looked impressive compared to the others, which regarded him watchfully. Binky was a real horse. The blisters in the shovel handle and Mort's hands were testimony to that. And compared to the others, he looked more real than ever. More solid, more horsey, slightly larger than life. In fact, Mort was on the verge of making an important deduction, and it is unfortunate that he was distracted as he walked across the yard to the inn's low door by the sight of the inn sign. Its artist hadn't been particularly gifted, but there was no mistaking the line of Kelly's jaw on her mass of fiery hair and the portrait of the Queen's head. He sighed and pushed open the door. As one man, the assembled company stopped talking and stared at him, with the honest rural stare that suggests that for 2 pins they'll hit you around the head with a shovel and bury your body under a compost heap at full moon. It might be worth taking another look at Mort, because he's changed a lot in the last few chapters. For example, while he still has plenty of knees and elbows about his person, they seem to have migrated to their normal places, and he no longer moves as though his joints were loosely fastened together with elastic bands. He used to look as if he knew nothing at all. Now he looks as though he knows too much. Something about his eyes suggested that he has seen things that ordinary people never see, or at least never see more than once. Something about all the rest of him suggests to the watchers that causing an inconvenience for this boy might be just as wise as kicking a wasp nest. In short, Mort no longer looks like something the cat brought in and then brought up. The landlord relaxed his grip on the stout blackthorn peacemaker he kept under the bar, and composed his features into something resembling a cheerful, welcoming grin, although not very much. "Evening, your lordship," he said. "Ed, what's your pleasure this cold and frosty night?" "What?" said Mort, blinking in the light.
What he means is, what do you want to drink?
Said a small, ferret-faced man sitting by the fire, who was giving Mort the kind of look a butcher gives a field full of lambs.
I don't know,
said Mort.
Do you sell Star Drip? Never heard of it, lordship.
Mort looked around at the faces watching him, illuminated by the firelight. They were the sort of people generally called the salt of the earth. In other words, they were hard, square, and bad for your health. But Mort was too preoccupied to notice.
What do people like to drink here, then?
The landlord looked sideways at his customers, a clever trick given that they were directly in front of him.
Why, lordship, we drink scumble for preference.
Scamble? Said Mort, failing to notice the muffled sniggers.
Aye, lordship, made from apples. Well, mainly apples.
This seemed healthy enough to Mort.
Oh, right,
he said.
A pint of scumble, then.
He reached into his pocket and withdrew the bag of gold that death had given him. It was still quite full. In the sudden hush of the inn, the faint clink of the coins sounded like the legendary brass gongs of Leshp, which can be heard far out to the sea on stormy nights as the currents stir them in their drowned towers 300 fathoms below.
And please serve these gentlemen with whatever they want, he added.
He was so overwhelmed by the chorus of thanks that he didn't take much notice of the fact that his friends were served their drinks in tiny thimble-sized glasses, while his alone turned up in a large wooden mug. A lot of stories are told about scumble, and how it is made out of the damp marshes according to ancient recipes handed down rather unsteadily from father to son. It's not true about the rats, or the snakeheads, or the lead shot. The one about the dead sheep is a complete fabrication. We can lay to rest all the variations of the one about the trouser button. But the one about not letting it come into contact with metal is absolutely true. Because when the landlord flagrantly shortchanged Mort and plonked the small heap of copper into a puddle of the stuff, it immediately began to froth. Mort sniffed his drink, and then took a sip. It tasted something like apples, something like autumn mornings, and quite a lot like the bottom of a log pile. Not wishing to appear disrespectful, however, he took a swig. The crowd watched him, counting under its breath. Mort felt something was being demanded of him.
Nice, he said. Very refreshing.
He took another sip.
Bit of an acquired taste, he added. But well worth the effort, I'm sure.
There were one or two mutters of discontent from the back of the crowd.
He's been watering the scumble, that's what 'tis. Hey, thou knows what happens if you let a drop of water touch scumble.
The landlord tried to ignore this.
You like it?
He said to Mort in pretty much the same tone of voice people use when they said to St. George,
You killed a what?
It's quite tangy, said Mort. It's sort of nutty.
Excuse me,
said the landlord, and gently took the mug out of Mort's hand. He sniffed it, then wiped his eyes.
He said, It's the right stuff, all right.
He looked at the boy with something verging on admiration. It wasn't that he drunk a third of a pint of scumble in itself. It was that he was still vertical and apparently alive. He handed the pot back again. It was as if Mort was being given a trophy after some incredible contest. When the boy took another mouthful, several of the watchers winced. Let me read that again. When the boy took another mouthful, several of the watchers winced. The landlord wondered what Mort's teeth were made of, and decided it must be the same stuff as his stomach.
You're not a wizard by any chance? He inquired, just in case.
Sorry, no. Should I be? Didn't think so, thought the landlord. He doesn't walk like a wizard, and anyway, he isn't smoking anything. He looked at the scumble pot again. There was something wrong about this. There was something wrong about the boy. He didn't look right. He looked more solid than he should do. That's actually the line. I didn't misread that. More solid than he should do. Okay? That was ridiculous, of course. The bar was solid, the floor was solid, the customer was as solid as you could wish for. Yet Mort, standing there looking rather embarrassed and casually sipping a liquid you could clean spoons with, seemed to emit a particularly potent sort of solidness, an extra dimension of realness. His hair was more hairy, his clothes more clothy, his boots the epitome of bootness. It made your head ache just to look at him. However, Mort then demonstrated that he was human after all. The mug dropped from his stricken fingers and clattered on the flagstones, where the dregs of scumble started to eat its way through them. He pointed at the far wall, his mouth opening and shutting wordlessly. The regulars turned back to their conversation and games of shovel-up, reassured that things were as they should be. Mort was acting perfectly normal now. The landlord, relieved that the brew had been vindicated, reached across the bar top and patted him companionably on the shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "It often takes people like this. You'll just have a headache for a few weeks, don't worry about it. A drop of scumble will see you all right again. It is a fact that the best remedy for a scumble hangover is a hair of the dog, although it should be more accurately be called a tooth of the shark or possibly a tread of the bulldozer." But Mort merely went on pointing and said in a trembling voice, "Can't you see it? It's coming through the wall. It's coming right through the wall." "A lot of things come through the wall after your first drink of scumble. Green, hairy things, usually." "It's the mist. Can't you hear it sizzling?" "A sizzling mist, is it?" The landlord looked at the wall, which was quite empty and unmysterious, except for a few cobwebs. The urgency in Mort's voice unsettled him. He would have preferred the normal scaly monsters. A man knew where he stood with them. "It's coming right across the room. Can't you feel it?" The customers looked at one another. Mort was making them uneasy. One or two of them admitted later that they did feel something rather like an icy tingle, but it could have been indigestion. Mort backed away and then gripped the bar. He shivered for a moment. "Look," said the landlord, "a joke's a joke, but you had a green shirt before." The landlord looked down. There was an edged terror in his voice. "Before what?" he quavered. To his astonishment, and before his hand could complete its surreptitious journey towards the blackthorn stick, Mort lunged across the bar and grabbed him by the apron. "You've got a green shirt, haven't you?" he said. "I saw it. It had little buttons. Little yellow buttons." "Well, yes, I have got two shirts." The landlord tried to draw himself up a little. "I'm a man of means," he added. "I just didn't wear it today." He didn't want to know how Mort knew about the buttons. Mort let him go and spun around. "They're all sitting in different places. Where's the man who was sitting by the fire? It's all changed." He ran out through the door, and there was a muffled cry from outside. He dashed back, wild-eyed, and confronted the horrified crowd. "Who changed the sign? Someone changed the sign!" The landlord nervously ran his tongue across his lips. After the old king died, you mean?" he said. Mort's look chilled him. The boy's eyes were two black pools of terror. "It's the name, I mean." It's always been the same name." "I can't decide on the landlord's voice," said the man, looking desperately at his customers for support. "Isn't that right, Lance? The Duke's head?" There was a murmured chorus of agreement. Mort stared at everyone, visibly shaking. Then he turned and ran outside again. The listeners heard hoofbeats in the yard, which grew fainter and then disappeared entirely, just as though a horse had left the face of the earth. There was no sound outside the... There was no outside... There was no sound inside the inn. Men tried to avoid one another's gaze. No one wanted to be the first to admit to seeing what he thought he had just seen. So it was left to the landlord to walk unsteadily across the room and reach out and run his fingers across the familiar, reassuring wooden surface of the door. It was solid, unbroken, everything a door should be. Everyone had seen Mort run through it 3 times. He just hadn't opened it. Binky fought for height, rising nearly vertically, with his hooves thrashing the air and his breath curling away beneath him like a vapor trail. Mort hung on with his knees and hands, and mostly with willpower, his face buried in his horse's mane. He didn't look down until the air was around him was freezing and thin as workhouse gravy. Overhead, the hub lights flickered silently across the wintered sky. Below, an upturned saucer, miles across, silvery in the starlight. He could see lights through it, clouds were drifting through it. No, he watched carefully. Clouds were certainly drifting into it, and there were clouds in it, but the clouds inside were wispier and moving in a slightly different direction, and in fact didn't seem to have much to do with the clouds outside. There was something else. Oh yes, the hub lights. They gave the night outside the ghostly hemisphere a faint green tint, but there was no sign of it under the dome. It was like looking into a piece of another world, almost identical, that had been grafted onto the disk. The weather was slightly different in there, and the lights weren't on display tonight. And the disk was resenting it, and surrounding it, and pushing it back into non-existence. Mort couldn't see it growing smaller from up here, but in his mind's ear he could hear the locust sizzle of the thing as it ground across the land, changing things back to where they should be. Reality was healing itself. Mort knew, without even having to think about it, who was at the center of the dome. It was obvious, even from here, that it was centered firmly on Stolat. He tried not to think what would happen when the dome had shrunk to the size of the room, and then the size of a person, and then the size of an egg. He failed. Logic would have told Mort that here was his salvation. In a day or two, the problem would solve itself. The books in the library would be right again, the world would have sprung back into shape like an elastic bandage. Logic would have told him that interfering with the process a second time around would only make things worse. Logic would have said all of that, if only logic hadn't taken off for the night, too. Light travels quite slowly on the disk due to the breaking effect of the huge magical field, and currently that part of the rim carrying the island of Krull was directly under the little sun's orbit, and it was, therefore, still early evening. It was also quite warm, since the rim picks up another more heat and enjoys a gentle maritime climate. In fact, Krull, with a large part of what, for want of a better word, must be called its coastline sticking out over the edge. Let me read that again. I'll also just check what time I have. 22 minutes. Light travels quite slowly on the disk due to its breaking effect of the huge magical field, and currently that part of the rim carrying the island of Krull was directly under the little sun's orbit, and it was, therefore, still early evening. It was also quite warm, since the rim picks up more heat and enjoys a gentle maritime climate. In fact, Krull, with a large part of what, for want of a better word, must be called its coastline, sticking out over the edge, was a fortunate island. The only native Krullians who did not appreciate this were those who didn't look where they were going, or who walked in their sleep, and because of natural selection, there weren't very many of them there anymore. All societies have their share of dropouts, but on Krull, they never had a chance to drop back in again. Terpsic Mims was not a dropout. He was an angler. There is a difference. Angling is more expensive. But Terpsic was happy.
Yeah.
He was watching a feather on a cork bob gently on the gentle reed-lined waters of the Huckrill River, and his mind was very nearly a blank. The only thing that could have disturbed his mood was actually catching a fish, because catching fish was the one thing about angling that he really dreaded. They were cold and slimy and panicky and got on his nerves, and Terpsic's nerves weren't very good. So long as he caught nothing, Terpsic Mims was one of the disk's happiest anglers because of the Huckrill River was 5 miles up from his home, and therefore 5 miles from Mrs. Gladys Mims, with whom he had enjoyed 6 happy months of married life. That had been some 20 years previously. Terpsic did not pay undue heed when another angler took up station further along the bank. Of course, some fishermen might have objected to the breach of etiquette, but in Terpsic's book, anything that reduced his chance of actually catching any of the damn things was all right by him. Out of the corner of his eye, he noted that the newcomer was fly fishing, an interesting pastime which Terpsic had rejected because one spent altogether far too much time at home making the equipment. He had never seen fly fishing like this before. There were wet flies and there were dry flies, but this fly augured into the water with a sawtooth whine and dragged the fish out backwards. Terpsich watched in horrified fascination at the indistinct figure behind the willow trees cast and cast again. The water boiled as the river's entire piscine population fought to get out of the way of the buzzing terror, and, unfortunately, a large and maddened pike took Terpsich's hook out of the sheer confusion. One moment he was standing on the bank, and the next he was in a green, changing gloom, bubbling his breath away, and watching his life flash before his eyes, and, even in the moment of drowning, dreading the thought of watching the bit between the day of the wedding and the present, it occurred to him that Gladys would soon be a widow, which cheered him up a little bit. In fact, Terpsich had always tried to look on the bright side, and it struck him as he sank gratefully into the silt that from this point on his whole life could only improve. And a hand grabbed his hair and dragged him to the surface, which was suddenly full of pain. Ghastly blue and black blotches swam in front of his eyes. His lungs were on fire. His throat was a pipe of agony. Hands, cold hands, freezing hands, hands that felt like a glove full of dice, towed him through the water and threw him down onto the bank, where after some game attempts to get on with drowning, he was eventually bullied back into what passed for his life. Terpsich didn't often get angry, because Gladys didn't hold it with it. But he felt cheated. He'd been born without being consulted, he'd been married before Gladys and her father had seen to it, and the only major human achievement that was uniquely his had been rudely snatched away from him. A few seconds ago, it had all been so simple. Now, it was all complicated again. Not that he wanted to die, of course. The gods were very firm on the subject of suicide. He just hadn't wanted to be rescued. Through red eyes and a mask of slime and duckweed, he peered at the blurred form above him and shouted, "Why did you have to save me?" The answer worried him. He thought about it as he squelched all the way home. It sat at the back of his mind when Gladys complained about the state of his clothes. It swirled around in his head as he sat and sneezed guiltily by the fire, because being ill was another thing Gladys didn't hold with. As he lay shivering in his bed, it settled in his dreams like an iceberg. In the midst of his fever, he muttered, "What do you mean, or later?" Torches flared in the city of Stolat. Whole squads of men were charged with the task of constantly renewing them. The streets glowed. The sizzling flames pushed back shadows that had been blamelessly minding their own business every night for centuries. They illuminated ancient corners where the eyes of bewildered rats glittered in the steps of their holes. They forced burglars to stay indoors. They glowed on the night mists, forming a nimbus of yellow light that blotted out the cold high flames streaming from the hub. But mainly, they shone on the face of Princess Kelly. It was everywhere. It plastered every flat surface. Binky cantered along the glowing streets between Princess Kelly on doors, walls, and gable ends. Mort gaped at posters of his beloved on every surface where workmen had been able to make paste stick. Even stranger, no one seemed to be paying them much attention. While Stolat's nightlife was not as colorful and full of incident as that of Ankh-Morpork, in the same way that a waste paper basket cannot compete with a municipal tip, the streets were nevertheless abustle with people and shrill with the cries of hucksters, gamblers, sellers of sweetmeats, pea and thimble men, ladies of assignation, pickpockets, and the occasional honest trader who had wandered in by mistake and could now raise enough money to leave. As Mort rode through them, snatches of conversation in half a dozen languages floated into his ears. With numb acceptance, he realized he could understand every one of them. He eventually dismounted and led the horse along Wall Street, searching in vain for Cutwell's house. He found it only because a lump on the nearest poster was making muffled swearing noises. He reached out gingerly and pulled aside a strip of paper. "Thanks very much," said the gargoyle dog or knocker. "You wouldn't credit it, would you? 1 minute life is normal, next minute a mouthful of glue." "Where's Cutwell?" "He's gone off to the palace." The knocker leered at him and winked a cast-iron eye.
Some men came and took all his stuff away. Then some other men started pasting pictures of his girlfriend all over the place. Bastards,
it added. Mort colored.
His girlfriend?
The door knocker, being of the demonic persuasion, sniggered at his tone. It sounded like fingernails being dragged over a file.
Yes, it said. They seemed in a bit of a hurry, if you ask me.
Mort was already up on Binky's back.
Arfay!
Shouted the knocker as he's retreating back.
Arfay! Can you unstick me, boy?
Mort tugged on Binky's reins so hard that the horse reared and danced crazily backwards across the cobbles, then reached out and grabbed the ring of the knocker. The gargoyle looked up into his face and suddenly felt like a very frightened door knocker. Indeed. Mort's eyes glowed with crucibles. His expression was a furnace. His voice held enough heat to melt iron. It didn't know what he could do, but felt that he would prefer not to find out.
What did you call me?
Mort hissed. The door knocker thought quickly.
Fur?
It said.
What did you ask me to do? Unstick me?
I don't intend to.
Fine,
said the door knocker.
Fine, that's okay by me. I'll just stick around then.
It watched Mort canter off along the street and shuddered with relief, knocking itself gently in its nervousness.
A narrow squeak.
A narrow squeak, said one of the hinges.
Shut up!
Mort passed night watchmen, whose job now appeared to consist of ringing bells and shouting the name of the princess, but a little uncertainly, as if they had difficulty remembering it. He ignored them, because it was listening to voices inside his head, which went,
She's only met you once, you fool. Why should she bother about you?
Yes, but I did save her life. That means
it belongs to her, not to you. Besides, he's a wizard.
So what? Wizards aren't supposed to go out with girls. They're celebrate.
Celebrate?
They're not supposed to, you know.
What? Never any you know at all?
And the internal voice, and it sounded as if it was grinning.
It's supposed to be bad for magic, thought Mort bitterly. What a place to keep magic.
Mort was shocked. Who are you? He demanded.
I'm you, Mort. Your inner self.
Well, I wish I'd get out of my head. It's quite crowded enough with me in here. Fair enough, said the voice. I was only trying to help. But remember, if you ever need you, you're always around. The voice faded away. That's a good line. If you ever need you, you're always around. Well, thought Mort bitterly, that must have been me. I'm the only one that calls me Mort. The shock of the realization quite obscured the fact that while Mort had been locked into the monologue, he had ridden right through the gates of the palace. Of course, people rode through the gates of the palace every day, but most of them needed the things to be opened first. The guards on the other side were rigid with fear because they thought they had seen a ghost. They would have been far more frightened if they had known that a ghost was almost exactly what they hadn't seen. The guard outside the doors of the great hall had seen it happen too, but he had time to gather his wits, or such that remained his spear as Binky trotted across the courtyard.
Halt! He croaked. Halt! What goes where?
Mort saw him for the first time. What? He said, still lost in thought. The guard ran his tongue over his dry lips and backed away. Mort slid off Binky's back and walked forward.
I meant what goes there?
The guard tried again, with a mixture of doggedness and suicidal stupidity that marked him for early promotion. Mort caught the spear gently and lifted it out of the way of the door. As he did, so the torchlight illuminated his fate. Mort, he said softly. It should have been enough for any normal soldier, but this guard was officer material.
I mean friend or foe,
he stuttered, trying to avoid Mort's gaze. Which would you prefer? He grinned. It wasn't quite the grin of his master, but it was a pretty effective grin and didn't have a trace of humor in it. The guard sighed with relief and stood outside. Pass, friend, he said. Mort strode across the hall towards the staircase that led to the royal apartments. The hall had changed a lot since he last saw it. Portraits of Kelly were everywhere. They even replaced the ancient and crumbling battle banners and the shadowy heights of the roof. Anyone walking through the palace would have found it impossible to go more than a few steps without seeing a portrait. Part of Mort's mind wondered why, just as another part worried about the flickering dome that was steadily closing on the city. But most of his mind was a hot and steamy glow of rage and bewilderment and jealousy. Isabel had been right. He thought this must be love. Isabel had been right. He thought this must be love.
The walk through walls, boy.
He jerked his head up. Cutwell was standing at the top of the stairs. The wizard had changed a lot, too, Mort thought bitterly. Perhaps not that much, though. Although he was wearing a black and white robe embroidered with sequins, although his pointy hat was a yard high and decorated with more mystic symbols than a dental chart, and although his red velvet shoes had silver buckles and toes that curled like snails, there were still a few stains on his collar, and he appeared to be chewing. He watched Mort climb the stairs towards him.
"Are you angry about something?" he said. "I started work, but I got rather tied up with other things. Very difficult walking through. Why are you looking at me like that?"
"What are you doing here?"
"I might ask you the same question. Would you like a strawberry?"
Mort glanced at the small wooden punnet in the wizard's hands.
"In midwinter?" "Actually, they're sprouts with a dash of enchantment."
"They taste like strawberries?" Cutwell sighed.
"No, like sprouts. The spell isn't totally efficient. I thought they might cheer the princess up, but she threw them at me. Shame to waste them. Be my guest."
Mort gaped at him. "She threw them at you?"
"Very accurately, I'm afraid. Very strong-minded young lady."
"Ha!" said a voice in the back of Mort's mind. "It's you again, pointing out to yourself that the chances of the princess ever contemplating with this fellow are on the far side of remote." "Go away," thought Mort. His subconscious was worrying him. It appeared to have a direct line to parts of his body that he wanted to ignore at the moment.
"Why are you here?" he said aloud. "Is it something to do with all these pictures?"
Oh wait, that was Mort that said this. Gotta read it right. "Why are you here?" he said aloud. "Is it something to do with all these pictures?"
"Good idea, wasn't it?" beamed Cutwell. "I'm rather proud of it myself."
"Excuse me," said Mort weakly. "I've had a busy day. I think I'd like to sit down somewhere."
"There's the throne room," said Cutwell. "There's no one in there at this time of night. Everyone's asleep."
Mort nodded and then looked suspiciously at the young wizard. "What are you doing up then?" he said.
Said Cutwell. I just thought I'd see if there was anything in the pantry."
He shrugged. Now's the time to report that Cutwell, too, notices that Mort, even a Mort weary with riding and lack of sleep, is somehow glowing from within, and in some strange way unconnected with size is nevertheless larger than life. The difference is that Cutwell is, by training, a better guesser than other people, and knows that in occult matters, the obvious answer is usually the wrong one. Mort can move absent-mindedly through walls and drink neat widowmaker soberly, not because he's turning into a ghost, but because he is becoming dangerously real. Ooh, that is so creepy. Checking the time here. 40 minutes. There had been half a jar of elderly mayonnaise, a piece of very old cheese, and a tomato with white mold growing on it. Since during the day, the pantry of the Palace of Stolat normally contained 15 whole stags, 100 brace of partridges, 50 hogsheads of butter, 200 jugs of hares, 75 sides of beef, 2 miles of assorted sausages, various fowls, 80 dozen eggs, several circle sea sturgeon, a bat of caviar, and an elephant's leg stuffed with olives. Cutwell had learned once again that one universal manifestation of raw, natural magic throughout the universe is this: that any domestic food store, raided furtively in the middle of the night, always contains, no matter what its daytime inventory, half a jar of elderly mayonnaise, a piece of very old cheese, and a tomato with white mold growing on it. Yeah, ain't that the truth? In fact, as the boy stumbles while they walk along the silent corridors and step through a marble pillar without noticing, it's obvious that the world is becoming a pretty insubstantial place from his point of view.
You just walked through a marble pillar, observed Cutwell. How did you do it?
Did I? Mort looked around. The pillar looked sound enough. He poked an arm towards it and slightly bruised his elbow.
I could have sworn you did, said Cutwell. Wizards notice these things, you know.
He reached into the pocket of his robe. Then have you noticed the mist dome around the country? Said Mort. Cutwell squeaked. The jar in his hand dropped and smashed on the tiles. Cutwell squeaked. The jar in his hand dropped and smashed on the tiles. There was the smell of slightly rancid salad dressing.
Already?
I don't know about already, said Mort, but there's this sort of crackling wall sliding over the land, and no one else seems to worry about it, and...
How fast is it moving?
It changes things.
You saw it? How far away is it? How fast is it moving?
Of course I saw it. I rode through it twice. It was like...
But you're not a wizard, so why...
What are you doing here, anyway? Cutwell took a deep breath.
Everyone shut up!
He screamed. There was silence. Then the wizard grabbed Mort's arm. Come on, he said, pulling him back along the corridor.
I don't know who you are exactly, and I hope I've got time to find out one day, but something really horrible is going to happen soon, and I think you're involved somehow.
Something horrible? When?
That depends on how far away the interface is and how fast it's moving,
said Cutwell, dragging Mort down a slide passage. When they were outside a small oak door, he let go of his arm and fumbled in his pocket again, removing a small, hard piece of cheese and an unpleasantly squashy tomato.
Hold these, will you? Thank you.
He delved again, producing a key, and unlocked the door. It's gonna kill the princess, isn't it? Said Mort.
Yes, said Cutwell. And then again, no.
He paused with his hand on the door handle.
That was pretty perspicacious of you. How did you know?
Mort hesitated.
She told me a very strange story, said Cutwell.
I expect she did, said Mort. If it was unbelievable, it was true.
You're him, aren't you? Death's assistant.
Yes. Off duty at the moment, though.
Pleased to hear it.
Cutwell shut the door behind them and fumbled for a candlestick. There was a pop, a flash of blue lights, and a whimper.
Sorry, he said, sucking his fingers. Fire spell. Never really got the hang of it.
You were expecting the dome thing, weren't you? Said Mort urgently. What will happen when it closes in? The wizard sat down heavily on the remains of a bacon sandwich.
I'm not exactly sure, he said. It'll be interesting to watch, but not from inside, I'm afraid. What I think will happen is that the last week will never have existed.
She'll suddenly die?
You don't quite understand. She will have been dead for all a week. All this, he waved his hand vaguely in the air, will not have happened. The assassin will have done his job. You will have done yours. History will have healed itself. Everything will be all right. From history's point of view, that is. There really isn't any other.
Mort stared out of the narrow window. He could see across the courtyard into the glowing streets outside, where a picture of the princess smiled at the sky. Tell me about the pictures, he said. That looks like some sort of wizard thing.
I'm not sure if it's working. You see, people were beginning to get upset, and they didn't know why, and that made it worse. Their minds were in one reality, and their bodies were in another. Very unpleasant. They couldn't get used to the idea that she was still alive. I thought the pictures might be a good idea, but, people just don't see what their minds tell them isn't there.
I could have told you that, said Mort bitterly.
I had the town criers out during the daytime, Cutwell continued. I thought that if people could come to believe in her, then this new reality could become the real one.
Umph, said Mort. He turned away from the window. What do you mean?
Well, you see, I reckon that if enough people believed in her, they could change reality. It works for gods. If people stop believing in a god, he dies. If a lot of them believe in him, he grows stronger.
I didn't know that. I thought gods were just gods.
They don't like it talked about, said Cutwell, shuffling through the heap of books and parchments on his work table. Well, that might work.
Well, that might work for gods because they're special, said Mort. People are more solid. It wouldn't work for people.
That's not true. Let's suppose you went out of here and prowled out of the palace. One of the guards would probably see you, and he'd think you were a thief, and he'd fire his crossbow. I mean, in his reality, you'd be a thief. It wouldn't actually be true, but you're just as dead as if he was. Belief is powerful stuff. I'm a wizard. We know about these things. Look here.
He pulled the book out of the debris in front of him and opened it at the piece of bacon he'd used as a bookmark. This guy's a slob. Mort looked over his shoulder and frowned at the curly magical writing. It moved around on the page, twisting and writhing in an attempt not to be read by a non-wizard, and the general effect was unpleasant. What's this?
It's the Book of Magic of Alberto Malak the Mage, said the wizard, a sort of book of magical theory. It's not a good idea to look too hard at the words. They resent it. Look, it says here.
His lips moved soundlessly. Little beads of sweat sprang up on his forehead, and decided to get together and go down and see what his nose was doing. His eyes watered. Some people like to settle down with a good book. No one in possession of a complete set of marbles would like to settle down with a book of magic, because even the individual words have a private and vindictive life of their own, and reading them, in short, is a kind of mental Indian wrestling. I'm busy there. Many a young wizard has tried to read a grimoire that is too strong for him, and people who've heard the screams have found only his pointy shoes with the classic wisp of smoke coming out of them, and a book which is perhaps just a little fatter. Things can happen to browsers in magical libraries that make having your face pulled off by tentacled monstrosities from the dungeon dimension seem a mere light message by comparison. Let me reread that again. Things can happen to browsers in magical libraries that make having your face pulled off by tentacled monstrosities from the dungeon dimension seem a mere light massage by comparison. There we go. Fortunately, Cutwell had an expurgated edition, with some of the more distressing pages clamped shut, although on quiet nights he could hear the imprisoned words scritching irritably inside their prison, like a spider trapped in a matchbox. Anyone who has ever sat next to someone wearing a Walkman will be able to imagine exactly what they sounded like.
This is the bit, said Cutwell. It says here that even gods...
I've seen him before.
What?
Mort pointed a shaking finger at the book. Him! Cutwell gave him an odd look and examined the left-hand page. There was a picture of an elderly wizard holding a book and a candlestick in an attitude of near-terminal dignity.
That's not a part of the magic, he said testily. That's just the author.
What does it say under the picture?
It says, if you're have enjoyed this book, you may be interested in other titles by...
No, right under the picture is what I meant.
That's easy. It's old Malak himself. Everyone knows him. I mean, he founded the university.
Cutwell chuckled.
There's a famous statue of him in the main wall, and during Rag Week, once I climbed it up and
Mort stared at the picture. Tell me, he said quietly, did the statue have a drip on the end of its nose?
I shouldn't think so, said Cutwell. It was marble, but I don't know what you're getting so worked up about. Lots of people knew what he looked like. He's famous.
He lived a long time, did he?
2,000 years, I think. Look, I don't know why.
I bet he didn't die, though, said Mort. I bet he just disappeared one day, did he? Cutwell was silent for a moment.
Funny you should say that, he said slowly. There was a legend I heard. He got up to some weird things, they say. They say he blew himself up into the dungeon dimensions while trying to perform the rite of Ashka Ente backwards. All they found was his hat. Tragic, really. The whole city in mourning for a day just for a hat. It wasn't even a particularly attractive hat. It had burn marks on it.
Alberto Malak, said Mort, half to himself. Well, fancy that.
Clearly Albert.
He drummed his fingers on the table, although the sound was surprisingly muted.
Sorry, said Cutwell. I can't get the hang of treacle sandwiches either.
I recommend the interface is moving at a slow walking pace, said Mort, licking his fingers absent-mindedly. Can't you stop it by magic?
Cutwell shook his head. Not me. It'd squash me flat, he said cheerfully.
What'll happen to you when it arrives, then?
Oh, I'll go back to living in Wall Street. I mean, I never will have left. All this won't have happened. Pity, though. The cooking here is pretty good, and they do my laundry for free. How far away did you say it was, by the way?
About 20 miles, I guess. Cutwell rolled his eyes heavenwards and moved his lips eventually, he said.
That means it'll arrive around midnight tomorrow, just in time for the coronation.
Whose?
Hers.
But she's queen already, isn't she?
In a way, but officially she's not queen until she's crowned.
Cutwell grinned, his face a pattern of shade in the candlelight, and added,
If you want a way of thinking about it, then it's like the difference between stopping living and being dead.
20 minutes earlier, Mort had been feeling tired enough to take root. Now he could feel a fizzling in his blood. It was the kind of late-night frantic energy that you knew would pay for around midday tomorrow, but for now he felt he had to have some action or else his muscles would snap out of sheer vitality. I want to see her, he said. If you can't do anything, there might be something I can do.
There's guards outside her room, said Cutwell. I mentioned this as merely an observation. I don't imagine for 1 minute that they'll make the slightest difference.
It was midnight in Ankh-Morpork, but in the great Twin City, the only difference between night and day was, well, it was darker. The markets were thronged, the spectators were still thickly clustered around the whore pits, runners-up in the city's eternal and Byzantine gang warfare drifted silently down through the chilly waters of the river with lead weights tied to their feet. Dealers in various illegal and even illogical delights plied their sidelong trade. Burglars, burgles, knives flashed starlight in alleyways, astrologers started their day's work, and in the shades a night watchman, who had lost his way, rang his bell and cried out,
12 o'clock and over.
However, the Ankh-Morpork Chamber of Commerce would not be happy at the suggestion that the only real difference between their city and a swamp in the number of legs on the alligators, and indeed in the more select areas of Ankh, which tend to be in the hilly districts where there is a chance of bit of wind, the nights are gentle and scented with abyssine and Cecilia blossoms. On this particular night, they were scented with saltpeter, too, because it was the 10th anniversary of the accession of the patrician, and he had invited a few friends around for a drink, 500 of them in this case, and was letting off fireworks. Laughter and the occasional gurgle of passion filled the palace gardens, and the evening had just got to that interesting stage where everyone had drunk too much for their own good, but not enough actually to fall over. It is the kind of state in which one does things that one will recall with a crimson shame in later life, such as blowing through a paper squeaker and laughing so much that one is sick. In fact, some 200 of the patrician's guests were now staggering and kicking their way through the serpent dance, a quaint Morporkian folkway which consisted of getting rather drunk, holding the waist of the person in front, and then wobbling and gigging uproariously in a long crocodile that wound through as many rooms as possible. Uproariously in a long crocodile that I don't know what that means. Preferably ones with breakables in, while kicking one leg vaguely in time with the beat, or at least in time with some other beat. Ankh-Morpork had dallied with many forms of government, and had ended up with the form of democracy known as one man, one vote. The patrician was the man. He had the vote. This dance had gone on for half an hour, and had wound through every room in the palace, picking up 2 trolls, the cook, the patrician's head torturer, 3 waiters, a burglar who happened to be passing, and a small pet swamp dragon. Somewhere around the middle of the dance was fat Lord Rodley of Quirm, heir to the fabulous Quirm estates, whose current preoccupation was with the thin fingers gripping his waist. Under its bath of alcohol, his brain kept trying to attract his attention.
"I say,"
he called over his shoulder as they oscillated for the 10th hilarious time across the enormous kitchen.
"Not too tight, please." "I am most terribly sorry."
"Yes."
"No offense, old chap. I know you,"
said Lord Rodley, kicking vigorously on the back beat.
"I think it is unlikely. Tell me, please." What is the meaning of this activity?
"Right," said Lord Rodley above the sound of someone kicking in the door of a glass cabinet amid shrieks of merriment.
What is this thing that we do? Said the voice with glacial patience.
"Have you ever been to a party before? Mine are the last, by the way."
I am afraid I do not get out much, as I would like to. Please explain this. Does it have to do with sex?
"Not unless we're full up sharp, old boy, if you know what I mean." And his lordship and nudged his unseen fellow guest with his elbow. "Ouch," he said. A crash up ahead marked the demise of a cold buffet.
No.
"What?"
I did not know what you mean.
"Mind the cream there, it's slippery. Look, it's just a dance, alright? You do it for fun."
Fun.
"That's right. Da-da-da-da-da, kick."
There is an audible pause. Who is this fun?
Now, fun isn't anybody. Fun is what you have.
We are having fun?
"I thought it was," said the lordship uncertainly. The voice by his ear was vaguely worrying him. It appeared to be arriving directly into his brain.
What is this fun?
"This is."
To kick vigorously is fun?
"Well, part of the fun. Kick."
To hear loud music in hot rooms is fun?
"Possibly."
How is this fun manifest?
"Well, look, either you're having fun or you're not. You don't have to ask me. You just know, alright? How did you get in here, anyway?" He added, "Are you a friend of the patrician?"
Let us say he puts business my way. I felt I ought to learn something of human pleasures.
"Sounds like you've got a long way to go."
I know. Please excuse my lamentable ignorance. I wish only to learn. All these people, please, they are having fun?
"Yes."
Then this is fun.
"I'm glad we got that all sorted out. Mind the chair," snapped Lord Radley, who was now feeling very unfunny and unpleasantly sober. A voice behind him said quietly, "This is fun. To drink excessively is fun. We are having fun. He is having fun. This is some fun. What fun?" Behind Death, the patrician's small pet swamp dragon held on grimly to the bony hips and thought, "Guards or no guards, next time we pass an open window, I'm going to run like buggery." That's a good stopping point for the night. Yeah. Yep. Nearly about over halfway done this book. I'm enjoying it. For those of you who watched it, I hope you enjoyed it. If not, well, I did it for myself, It's kind of a reading journal, Sometimes it's good to do things by yourself. Sometimes you don't have to make things for other people. Sometimes you can just read a book aloud and record yourself, Because you find reading aloud helps you remember it. Get it stuck in your brain. Do things for yourself more often. If you got to the end of this video, keep that in mind. And try to have a neater office. Okay, ending it now. Have a time.